Hello, everyone. Have you ever read The Vintagent? It's likely that if you love motorcycles or motoring in general, you've probably read something from Paul d'Orleans, who is our guest today. I'm so excited to have Paul on the show. We had such a nice conversation. Actually, nice is not the right word. It was graceful, motivating. It was an emotional conversation in some ways, or at least we talked about subjects that I've thought about a lot since, which makes sense because Paul d'Orleans is not someone who is easily forgotten. He has a deep knowledge of motorcycles and art, and he really comes at life itself in a very particular way. And you really sense that in his work and his writing, but also just in his presence and his style and the way that he and his wife Susan go through life together. It really all feels like a cumulative artwork. He's very individual, but he's also someone who brings community together. The Vintagent, the blog I just mentioned, is a community space for motorcycling, but also for art and design and film. It's just a space that didn't exist before he created it over 15 years ago. And now, of course, it gets thousands and thousands of views every day, and it opens all these new paths and relationships. And it also collects stories that are so important, people that we might not know about, or that would just be forgotten otherwise. Paul also does this with his photographies and his celebration of film. He's a curator, too, on top of all that, for various museums, but we've talked a lot on this show about electric revolutionaries, which he curated at the Peterson Museum in LA, and it displayed the work of many of our past guests and upcoming guests, such as JT Nesbitt of Curtis Motorcycles, or Hugo Eckles and XP0. But Paul's also done a few other amazing exhibits, which we talk about here too. To be honest, it's really hard to give a quick summary of Paul because he's an artist, he's an art historian, he's a curator, he's an author. He's written some books that actually have changed the narrative about motorcycling a bit, like Cafe Racer and Ton Up, where he showed that this cafe style that we often associate with, for example, London in a particular time period, actually started in many places at many times in the 20s and 30s, and you can follow it across geographies and across time periods. So yeah, gosh, there's so much. There's art, there's history, there's life. We talk about success and failure and what it all means when our lives are so entangled with our passions. We talk about eroticism and eros and this image of the woman on the motorcycle and of women and men and these traditional roles and images we have of them in terms of motoring and motorcycles, and ask if we might rethink some of those roles. So yeah, we explore this and these different ideas about what a ride is and what a rider is. Now that bikes are changing and there's this whole electric experience, how this might change too and evolve into something even better than we've imagined thus far, while also still respecting this beautiful history of motorcycling that we talk about here too, because Paul, of course, has spent a lot of his life documenting that. He's also been a judge for some of the most prestigious and internationally renowned motorcycle events in the world. He's on Motor Trend TV. He's worked on some books with Gestatten that you've likely seen, The Ride, for example, or The Current, just amazing visual books. The Current was one of the first books about electric bikes to come out, and it was based on his thread he had started on the Vintagent about electric transportation, which was one of the very earliest threads. So we talk about how he wrote about this change that was going to come in motoring and is now upon us, and about electric and what it means and some of the pushback that he's gotten by writing about that. Also some of the inevitabilities of what we have to face for the future, and also the beauty and the positive side of it all, what's possible, this whole other potential that's possible before us now. We also talk about his friend Richard Vincent, who was a great motorcycle racer, surfer, pilot, photographer, another Renaissance man who found an ecological way to heal from war, and he had just passed away when Paul and I talked, so we do mention him and this movie that Paul had been making about him and is still making about him and how it connects to these themes. We talk about motorcycles almost like time capsules of movement, especially two-wheeled movement, and the styles that come out of that and the connections we find between the way we feel and the way we move through the world, and how that connects to the vehicles that we want to move us and what kind of future we want to move towards. So Paul's thought a lot about this and written a lot about it, and he's a connector, he's a community builder, he's really articulate and about writing about what moves us in the world, be that motorcycles or otherwise. We talked for many hours. I, of course, edited it down to about half, but I did leave the conversation in its natural flowing state because I want to let these conversations go where they will. Whether they're short or long, it actually goes very fast. I do want to mention an inventor named Samuel Obaji from Ghana. Another project that Paul works on is the Motorcycle Arts Foundation, which he started with his team. And they promote and support new forms of education and invention in vehicle culture. This is another really important part of Paul's work, which he didn't have much time to get into, but one inventor that he's working with is Samuel. And he's a young man from Ghana who actually found a way to build solar-powered scooters just from scrap. He's a really smart guy and doing amazing things, and I'm going to link to him in the show notes since we didn't get to talk too much about him, but I hope we'll do another show and talk more about him or maybe even talk to him. Also, I want to mention, we couldn't remember, there's a film we talk about, a surreal motorized experience of eros. The name of that film is Impatience, and I'll also link to it in the show notes. Also, we have a new Instagram account, so please, if you want to go and have a look at it or help me out, it's at Forever Motoring Pod. Forever, MOTORINGPOD. So I'd love to see you there, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Let's go. Hey, Paul, welcome to Forever Motoring. It's so nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Happy to be here.
So this is a podcast about what moves us and the ways we move. So tell me about a time in your life when you remember being moved.
Well, 2 weeks ago, I did a 9-day tour of Italy as guests of the Vittorelli family. Claudia Vittorelli is a friend of ours in New York City who rides, and her father's a collector in Torino. And they offered to organize a 9-day ride down Italy from Torino to their house in Lauria, southeast of Naples in the mountains. And it was all on vintage bikes. So a bunch of V7 Sport, Mark 1 Le Mans. I was riding a R90 SBMW with my wife, Susan, on the back, and it was fantastic. We spent the night in various amazing towns near Cinque Terre and the Amalfi Coast. But I think my favorite was a little town called Orvieto in Tuscany. It's a medieval walled city, and the cathedral there was outrageous. I studied architecture and architectural history and a lot of art history. So I'm familiar with a lot of the more famous buildings in Italy, but I wasn't familiar with this church. The level of decoration was amazing. There was something about the murals and some of the paintings. I was really, really moved, really inspired by this location. It was like, I need to come back here. We only had a day in this place and only a morning at the cathedral because we were moving on later in the day. And I just wanted to hang out and study the artwork. And, I started out at university as a painter, and I do art and illustration like pretty regularly, but not as a profession. And it made me want to go back to my paintbrushes and make something extraordinary like the frescoes and the paintings that I saw in this church. Just amazing. And actually my inspiration was to do something related to motorcycling, instead of horses, you'd have people on motorcycles and it's heraldic kind of imagery. I thought it'd be hilarious. But anyway, so yeah, that was the last time I was really, frankly, moved.
Already has a lot of themes I want to talk to you about in there, so that's great. But so you rode there and came to the space, and the space itself was just kind of overwhelming with the beauty.
Well, Claudia and Gaetano had never organized like a multi-day ride with multiple people. We had with us Dave Roper, who was like the first American to win the Isle of Man TT, and Kenny Cummings, who was an American Formula 750 champion. So it was a small group of very experienced riders. And,
wow. It's like a celebrity group there.
It kind of, and it was still like herding cats, every day getting away. And just things happen on the road. I think that morning I got a flat tire. Yeah. On the BMW. And it was like May Day weekend. And amazingly, through connections in Naples, we were able to find a tire shop that would open up. They had the right tire, boom, we were out, or the right inner tube, and boom, we were out of there in an hour, and spent that time, eating like fresh local mozzarella balls, like whole,
Oh,
pretty outrageous.
no.
So the food was inspiring too. So anyway, it was a long day. We didn't arrive at Orvieto until like 10 o'clock at night after traversing some really narrow roads and probably 10 miles of pretty bad roads. We arrive at this walled city and it's incredible. We go for a very late dinner, which is fine in Italy, and extraordinary food. And then the next morning, it's like, okay, we got to get to the cathedral. So it was just that morning. We were leaving at like 11 a.m. We only had 150 miles to ride, but you're in Europe. 150 miles is the day ride in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't go that fast. And we were all on back roads. So, and there are places to stop.
So you said you studied architecture. What? Take me back a little bit to when you were first going to school and what you had. What were your dreams?
I have a rambling mind. At first, I started doing meditation when I was, like 12. Learned kind of like an official technique when I was like 15. So I was very much into consciousness and kind of the study of consciousness. And UC Santa Cruz had a history of consciousness department. And I knew one of the people who was a grad student, a PhD student there. And so I applied as a biophysics major because I was really interested in the kind of like, what are the origins of consciousness? What's the synaptic origins, the spark between a thought and its neurological correlate? So I started doing all the science classes, that you have to, chemistry and biology. But I was also really interested in organic food and agriculture. And Santa Cruz also had the first university research organic farm. And so that first year I volunteered on the farm and was studying agroecology along with this other science with some real founders of the field, kind of to blow, with all that science and stuff, to blow off steam. And my spring semester, I took a drawing class. I'd never taken an art class before. In fact, in high school, the only two classes I got anything less than an A in was art and creative writing. I got B's in both those classes, which is hilarious. That became, of course, my career. I had this epiphany that, no, actually, I'm an artist. Didn't preclude the, let's say, more intellectual pursuits, but it was like, that was the core of my passion. So actually, I carried on studying art history, and there was an incredible architectural historian at UC Santa Cruz named Rainer Banham, who had been friends with everybody. He was friends with Corbusier, he was friends with Frank Lloyd Wright, he was friends with, Ansel Adams, fascinating guy, taught by anecdote mostly, talking about Corbusier and his constructions in Europe. And so I took a class from him literally every semester afterwards because he became kind of a mentor. And there was actually an official design program at UCSC. So I was enrolled in the design program while doing the art and studying all this other stuff, agroecology. So I studied a lot of other things. And after university, I made my living for 25 years as a decorative painter and a muralist with a serious motorcycle problem.
What does it mean exactly, decorative painter? Did people commission you to do things?
Yeah, basically, I had a kit of colors and I taught myself how to do anything you could do with paint. So if someone wanted a wall to look like marble or wood, I figured out how to do it. But I became more specialized in color work, like choosing specific colors for spaces and then creating techniques that were like typically multiple layers of glazes or washes. And so that's what I became known for, like really specific environments where the walls just kind of glowed in a way that you could not define.
It makes me want to see one, but I guess you have to be in the presence of it rather than see it. You have photographs?
Exactly.
Okay.
Hard to photograph. No. It's really hard to get the sense of how you capture light on a wall.
Yeah, I guess you have to be in the space in a way. Kind of like if you just seen pictures of the cathedral you went to, it's a little different than walking into it.
Or if you see a photo of a rough superior versus, watching it and hearing it and smelling it and seeing the valves move. And, it's like.
Yes, absolutely. That sensory experience.
Sorry.
So it sounds like you were already really interested in everything, sort of trying to figure out the world in a way. I guess you kind of do that now on the blog. You touch a little bit of all these so-called disciplines, but you just were curious.
Curious.
Would you say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Curious.
And was the motorcycling part of that?
Yeah, I became really curious about motorcycles. I had learned to ride when I was 15. I hated high school, and I lived in my father was a professor at university in Stockton, University of Pacific, and which was a really dangerous city at the
Yeah, well,
late 70s, murder capital of the USA.
oh,
And so I wanted to graduate a year early from high school, and I found out if I took just 2 night classes at the local community college, I could in fact graduate early. So I didn't want to take the bus. I didn't want to ride my bicycle at night. So I bought a little Honda Express, and
oh,
so I knew
so
how to ride.
started out for practical reasons.
Totally practical, and didn't really fall in love with motorcycling, although I enjoyed it.
Hmm.
After university, I had a friend who was a journeyman printer, and I was very involved in kind of anarchist politics and a big anarchist scene, like a punk rock anarchist scene. And my friend Jim Gilman was a journeyman printer, and I can get an old used multi-lith printer from my work for free. And if we can set it up, we can print multicolored posters and books and things like that. And so that's what we did. We set it up in my mother's garage, hilarious. And we're printing like books of poetry by the likes of Peter Plate, or a lot of event posters and things. And Jim rode like a 1955 BMW R50 that he'd found under a staircase. And I was just entranced by this funky old motorcycle he rode. And fairly shortly after, bought my own BMW. I bought an R75/5, and then I bought an R26, a single cylinder BMW. And Jim was super conflicted as a person who felt like he was too attached to motorcycles, and he had collected every issue of Classic Bike and Classic Motorcycle, which in 1984 was not much. It's like 2 milk crates. And he gave them all to me. He says, you know what, it's just too much. My obsession is too much. So it was like handing me a bag of heroin, a spoon, and a needle. Like, oh my
Was
God.
it that immediate? Was it just like an addiction from the beginning?
Yeah, totally. And so I just read all those magazines from cover to cover, and became really curious about bikes. I would get on my little motorcycle. I loved my little single cylinder BMW. It was so fun to ride around town. And I would ride to every used bookstore in San Francisco and buy any motorcycle books they had.
Oh, wow.
And like pretty soon, even in the mid 80s, I had like hundreds of books, general anthologies or more specific or mark histories or whatever, stories, travel. And so that began my self-education on motorcycle history.
It's interesting. It seems like it was really related to the writing and the reading already. It sounds like part of what really stimulated you and got you addicted was also reading about it in the stories or learning the history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I was super intrigued by the design and kind of like the context around like what was the context of these motorcycles, like who rode them, who developed them, what were the subcultures associated with them. I got really interested in kind of the rocker subculture of the 50s and 60s in England. And kind of dug in on that. What were the bikes they rode? So I started riding like a Norton Atlas that was a cafe racer. Really got into fast vintage motorcycling. And I had friends. We had started a motorcycle club called the Road Holders in the 80s,
nice.
which actually included a fellow named Robin Talloohy, who was getting his degree in physics at UC Berkeley at the time, and went on to win Daytona 4 times on motorcycles of his own construction. And then after he got his doctorate in fluid dynamics, went on to design chassis for first the Victory motorcycle. And then he got hired at Renault Formula One and designed their racing chassis and won the 2 world championships. And then he went to Mercedes Formula One and won them 2 world championships. And I actually wrote a big article about him in Cycle World. You can look it up. Dr. Rob Louis. And anyway, he was one of my great friends, and we're still in touch.
A fellow Renaissance man.
Yeah. It's like everybody in that group had at least a bachelor's degree, because that's just who we were. This is the people in San Francisco. It's like we were doing various things, DJs, or I had this painting business and other people did other things. And we coalesced around a common interest in actually riding old motorcycles, which at the time they seemed old, but nowadays they seem really freaking old. Now they're 50 years old, but then they were only like 10 years old,
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. But it
different.
seems like it was already a whole integrated lifestyle. I guess a little bit like the cafe racer myth, which you would later write about. So, was this during when you were studying art history?
After university, but yes, I learned how
Okay.
to for sure. Yeah, it's kind of curious. There was this post-punk rock, I would say quite global, but there was a movement before the internet. You know, people in London and Berlin and in Paris and in New York and San Francisco were simultaneously kind of rediscovering this kind of rocker subculture, and were really into cafe racers and into the look and the vibe. And we had no idea each other existed.
Oh.
Like I had the road holders in Paris, there was the Triton Club de Paris. In London, there was the Mean Fuckers Motorcycle Club. uh, Actually, Triton Club still exists. The Mean Fuckers still exist. A lot of very well-known people are members. They
This
were
was
all
in
kind
the
of,
80s or the 90s or
yeah, this is in the 80s.
80s. Wow. Okay.
And they were all kind of, they weren't strict clubs. We weren't like,
Mm-hmm.
there were no meetings or anything like that. We would just go for rides. And that was true across the board. Or if there was a meeting, it was just like a gathering at a pub or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of fascinating, this kind of spontaneous sort of zeitgeisty moment where people were interested in the clothing, the subculture, the bikes, and kind of reliving it. And that was really the core of me writing about, let's say, my first book about cafe racers, which was called Cafe Racers.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2014, I included that experience. And then I kind of repeated it more recently in 2020, did Ton Up, also included that kind of global zeitgeisty moment that actually had a pretty resounding impact, because a lot of the people who were into that movement in the 80s went on to impact, let's say, fashion, or impact, let's say, writing, like myself, who went on to start blogs and things a little bit later, or were involved with big shows and things like that. So it's kind of a seminal moment, this kind of post-punk rock moment. I would say we were punk/rockers.
Yeah, I like this idea of these things starting in different places around the world, but with a common thing. I mean, it happens a lot, right? Even with like scientific inventions or something, where it seems like there's something happening and different people are picking it up in different places. And then, like you were saying, it does end up sort of changing the trajectory of social and maybe even economic things in a much bigger sense. But of course, back then, I guess you were just sort of living it. So how did
Yeah.
you end up actually becoming yourself? I mean, you're often called a motorcycle historian. And actually, I was going to bring up the Cafe Racer book and Ton Up and the writing you've done, because you kind of opened a different way of thinking about the Cafe Racer, not only the typical London Ace Cafe English rocker version, but you actually showed, similar to the way you're saying it happened in the 80s, that there was something already happening maybe in the 20s. I think you talk about a few examples, the 30s.
Yeah.
Like this was actually more of a pattern that just got named different things. So I guess I'd like to know how you ended up really becoming a historian and actually discovering this new narrative, historical narrative.
Yeah. I mean, there were people who had hinted. There was a book called Cafe Racers by Mike Clay that was published, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. And he mentioned, he had a chapter on the Promenade Percies, which was in England. Let's say those were the cafe racers of the 30s. And I dug in a lot harder on that subject for Ton Up, and poured through, thank God for, these days, Google or web searches. I was able to go through English newspaper archives searching for terms like Promenade Percy. And I found like the first use of the term and how it developed and what it meant. And but I also knew that similar things were happening in the United States, and also, Australia and in Europe. And I have a pretty big photo archive, and I was actually able to look through. I have friends with also enormous photo archives, and I just kind of knew what to look for. It's like, this is what a motorcycle looks like of someone who likes to ride fast. It's not encumbered with a lot of crap. It's
Hmm.
pretty stripped down, sometimes extremely stripped down. It has low handlebars. Sometimes it doesn't have a muffler. It's like, or drop bars, at least drop bars. So, if looking through these photo archives pretty regularly, I would find, oh my God, there's someone in 1914 with a bike that's clearly built for speed. There's someone from 1921 in Germany. Or amazingly, like Phil Irving, who went on to co-design the Vincent motorcycle in the 20s. He was a total tearaway. Had this AJS motorcycle that he had the tank copper plated, then overpainted so it looked like metallic gold with purple accents. I'm like, whoa. And he talks about that the bike was completely illegal because it didn't have any lights or any muffler or anything, and how he would slap the number plate from another motorcycle on it.
Okay.
And how much fun that was. And like, oh my God, I did the same thing, nothing changes.
That almost sort of goes over into the custom and that part of your writing too. But first, I want to think about the style. Did you find a similar style too? I don't necessarily mean wearing the same clothes, but a kind of countercultural thing that went along with this too.
I mean, there was always a concern with style. In fact, everybody, let's say, for example, the Promenade Percies in England, everyone who wrote about it talked about their clothing as well. Like, they wore slick suits, the bikes were shiny, their hair was a certain way. And then, for example, Phil Irving talked about, I have no doubt, a quote is, I have no doubt that clothes maketh the man. And he talked about what he would wear, and there's photographs of him. He looks amazing. He's wearing like a beret and like an Oxford University V-neck sweater with the stripes, and then some jodhpurs and some boots. And he looks like smashing. And it's like 1926, and so I don't know why there is such a connection with style. Worth exploring.
Yeah, somewhere you say, I think it's in the book, in your the essay you write for the writers, you say that motorcycling is about grace and eros, I think, or eroticism or something. And somehow eros, okay. And I think this is something I'd like to explore, or get your thoughts on too, that you can't really disconnect the motorcycle from, first, you're already kind of on the edge. There's a bit of edge work just in riding the bike. And then also the experience itself is sort of comes with, you have to take a particular style, or there's something about it, this eros. So I don't know. I just wonder, like, what do you think about that? And this grace too, right? Because there's something about it that demands that you get in a graceful state, even if it's not something you create yourself.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I think eros is, in that kind of the Greek sense, like this, like a vitality or a sense of life, of being alive. And erotism can be a part of that in terms of like a more sexual component, but I really intend it as like the all-encompassing sense of like really feeling alive, which I think everyone feels on a motorcycle, right? Maybe not in town, but once you get out of town, it's just such a rich and visceral experience, And yeah, for sure, the grace aspect is the lyricism of like moving through space and the playing with gravity as you go around corners. It's such an elegant activity, even if it's tense and fraught because you're going really fast. It's still a vital experience. So maybe someone who is attracted to that, or who responds to that, is also a person who might feel the need to cut a figure in the world, to wear a particular style, or to express themselves that way. I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer for that, but I know that a lot of people who are into like fast motorcycling and historically had a particular look about them. And it was not always the same. Like, I gave a lecture, a Zoom talk with a British motorcycle club in Vancouver last week, and talked about the Promenade Percies, but I also connected it with what was happening simultaneously in Europe and the United States. And the Americans had a much more casual sort of vibe about them, but they cut quite a figure. Even if they're wearing a chambray shirt and loose khakis, they would have like maybe a neckerchief and a flat cap. And it's like, yeah, it looked pretty badass.
It
They're
looks
not
pretty
wearing,
good. Yeah. Even
yeah,
some
they're
of
not
just the
wearing,
early bicycle riders, like Glenn Curtis, or a few of those, they look quite beautiful the way they're
yeah,
dressed up just to ride the bikes. And then when you get into the motorcycles, it gets even better.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there has been, I think, a strong thread since forever, of two wheels with style. Not everyone, of course, but the people you want to write about, definitely. And actually, it's a subject I've considered really digging into for an exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
That
I
would be
think
really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, a dear friend of mine, Conrad Leach, who's now an artist. He was one of the Mean Funkers, actually.
Oh,
He was chief menswear designer at the Burton Group in England, which is like top man for a while. Actually, Alexander McQueen was one of his interns.
oh, wow.
And he gave that up to become a painter. He had an exhibition which sold out. That's where he is today. Now he's in Los Angeles. But we've talked about collaborating on an exhibition, exploring that very subject, like the impact of motorcycling and style. I think it's a
Yeah,
rich,
definitely. The
rich subject.
impact. And it kind of goes both ways. Also, a lot in popular culture, there's something about the image of a person on a motorcycle, maybe whether it's in rock music or almost anywhere you can find. There's a certain image that people want to have, even if they don't ride. Sometimes they want to have this image.
Oh yeah, fashion has been ripping off motorcycle culture for decades,
Hmm.
and as you say, music too. I mean, I think
Hmm.
the aesthetic of punk was definitely influenced by motorcycle culture. It was transformed by Vivienne Westwood into something completely new, but I definitely think that, well, motorcycling and bondage
Hmm.
were the strongest threads, and drag
Yeah,
all
well,
of
there's a lot
that.
of overlaps even with the style. But I like what you said about the eroticism, because I think what I even mean by that is definitely more this, not between humans eroticism, but more this feeling that you have of just life itself being something that's erotic, that you feel very alive and awake with all your senses. The way we were talking about what the motorcycle does, it really wakes you up. And it's more like this feeling of being um, turned on by the world, not necessarily something sexual that comes,
Exactly.
I think, with motorcycle, with riding.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. It is one of my favorite things. And I've often felt like, a big component of my career as a writer has been like expressing that. It's like what people use cliches like freedom and things as like shorthand, because they really don't know how to say exactly that. It's like, what does this feel like? Why does this feel so good? Well, I feel free, and it's fine because a lot of people haven't really explored how do you express like why something makes you feel the way it does, reflect on that. They just know that it feels good and that's enough, and that they pursue it. But I think it's also, there are times when you really want to be able to express like why this is important to you and how it makes you feel. So I've been asked literally to express that in books many times over the years, which is great.
Yes, and I think
The
you've
word
found
gets
ways to
out.
do it. It's
Yeah.
not easy to do, but it reminds me a little bit of the thing you started with standing in the cathedral too, and also your own painting, the style that you found with the rooms. These things are very hard to explain or even to take a picture of, but you can somehow suggest them or create a little bit of the feeling of them through curation, which I think is what you do actually. Even with writing or with your books, a lot of them you put the right words with the right images or the right stories to evoke these things without necessarily just saying directly it's this.
Yeah. I mean, literal curation, because I, get
Yes.
hired to do exhibits at museums. So, yeah, definitely. It's funny. There's a lot of discussion about curation, especially with social media. Like a lot of people aren't really creating much, but they are curating images and
Mm,
putting them out into the world. But I think
mm,
it's a different thing when you are finding those things that you respond to and then you write about them. And then you explain why or what the connections are, or why it matters, and what the context was that brought these things together for you and what you're trying to say. That's been actually one of the most pleasurable things about curating exhibits, like at the Peterson Museum, is being asked to contextualize, like, what is this about? For example, we had this adventure overland exhibit there a couple of years
Mm.
ago, which was really fun. And
Spectacular, some of the
yeah,
things you had there, from like the
uh,
lunar
yeah, I just said,
bike
oh my
to,
God,
yeah.
overland.
Anyway,
Well,
I
like,
could get
let's
very
go.
excited about it, but I'll shut up.
Oh, it was amazing. I thought it was just amazing. Yeah, we had everything from actual like 1920s and 30s overlanding vehicles, motorcycles, and we had to, let's say, the Lost in Space chariot and an actual JPL model of Mars rovers, and it was such a great combination just to discuss the spirit of adventure and the spirit of exploration. And once again, this is another subject that I'm pursuing the development of as another exhibit. I'd like to really carry that theme forward in a touring exhibition, because I think that overlanding in the age of exploration is really says a lot about, like travel as a mode of education for people to get out of their box and realize that it's a big wide world and people do things really differently and also really the same, and I think that kind of wisdom is really important for the world, kind of the consciousness of a global unity. As different as people may appear, it's like, well, we're fundamentally the same. And so, non-military and non-religious overland travel, just for
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, I think is a spirit to really encourage, see.
Yeah, I love that idea. And just it makes me want to loop a few things together. For example, what you were saying about this social media curation. I think it's a little bit different to curate, like on Instagram, certain photos. Then there's a different kind of attention or awareness that goes when you're in a real life space, first of all, but also when you just put your attention on a particular subject the way you did, like when you have to find the context around a theme. And
Right.
this is a really different thing than just trying to stimulate through putting particular images together. But that gets to what you were saying about travel, because there's something about when we go to a different place and we have to travel to get there, or the travel itself is part of it, that there's a different kind of attention. Motorcycling requires that kind of attention. So I guess there's some connection there too between your meditation experiences early on when you were a kid, the way that you ride, I mean, being a rider,
Yeah.
motorcyclist, and
Yeah.
also this way that you're talking about your work, which maybe curation isn't quite the right word, but there's something about putting your attention on it and finding connections,
Mm.
almost the same way as this overland exploration.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say it's a particular way of thinking. It's like finding, integrating information and finding, like collecting like a lot of disparate data that has a connection, and then sort of finding what is the connection with all this. It's like, I find that really satisfying. It's kind of how I think. And so I chose motorcycling to do that because it was something I was passionate about and kind of addicted to. And it could have been anything, but this is what it is. It's turned out to be such a rich subject matter for me. Like,
When did it change over for you? Because you were doing the decorative painting, and you were writing, riding. But when did you start writing and actually the vintage? When did that come? That was early 2000s, or?
it's 2006. Yeah. I had done things like edited club newsletters for motorcycle clubs and stuff like that, a little bit of writing. But in 2006, I was in the Sartorialist blog, which is like a very famous fashion blog. And
Taking pictures on the streets, kind of,
he was
wasn't it?
like, yeah, he
Yeah,
took up Harry Callahan of the New York Times mantle of like street fashion photography. Um,
which became a
and,
huge thing.
it is huge. Yeah,
Hmm.
he really was the one that made it like huge in the Instagram and TikTok sense. But uh, actually, when I was featured, it was actually easier to have a blog, to comment on a blog. It was like Google's little trick, their
Mm-hmm.
trick. It's like, while you're here, why don't you start a blog? So I did, and I called it the vintage, which was a term that I'd known for a long time. That was originated in the 30s. It was just someone who was into old vehicles. basically. It was a generic term. And so I started very slowly posting photographs from events and things that I had done, or my own bikes. And uh, I started getting traction pretty quickly. And
Oh.
my best friend, who was much smarter than me on these things, this is your next career. This is going to be your next career. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, there's no money in this.
Oh, yes. You were ahead of your time there, too.
We were both right. But at one point, I challenged myself to post 3 times a week with a little more writing and photographs just to see what happened. And, kind of it exploded. It was really the first kind of older motorcycle oriented blog. And so I started getting like 30,000 views a month. And then I started to get asked by magazines like Cycle World to write articles for them and other magazines. And, it just kind of became much more of a career, let's say. I got asked by auction companies to write catalog descriptions, or I did color commentary for auctions starting in 2009, which was basically standing up at the podium next to the auctioneer and talk about every single motorcycle that went across the podium.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Well, can you imagine?
And hard.
500 motorcycles in a day.
Like a historical education in motorcycling.
Exactly. And I wasn't that strong on certain areas of motorcycling, especially American bikes. So over the course of a couple of years, I got pretty strong my motorcycle history. So I still do that, it's now Motor Trend TV every year. I do the big Las Vegas auction. I do 2 days of TV commentary, which is a lot of fun, actually.
Seems like a natural kind of thing for you.
It's really fun. And just telling stories about what this thing is and some anecdote about it. It's pretty cool, pretty chatty and cool. And I write for auction companies. I write catalog descriptions or articles for their magazines. So that's actually the bigger part of my income. I do make some money on the Vintage website per se, but I make a lot more just writing for other venues.
Yeah, you don't really do a lot of ads or anything like the way people would traditionally make a lot of money on those things, or do you?
Yeah. And I struggle with that because I have had people, over the years who have wanted to partner to do things. And I did partner. I hired an intellectual property development company a couple of years ago, and they analyzed all of the, at that point, what was it, 14 years of stories and intellectual property that I had created. And they gave some recommendations on avenues that I could actually develop to make more money, and spent 2 years doing that. We tried to start an electric vehicle festival.
Yeah, I thought that looked like it might still happen, or I was going to ask you about
Revolution. Yeah. And we partnered with someone who had a venue, and it looked like it was all going to go down. We had lots of interest from the industry, and that our partners fell apart. So that didn't happen. Then we tried to do another one at Palm Springs last November, and there just wasn't that much support. And I kind of gave up on that idea. So I've spent the last 6 months really sort of meditating on, well, what's the most important thing here? What really moves me, as we were talking, which is my motivation. Well, I'm just kind of going back to the core of the vintage. I love doing curation. So looking at doing larger scale curation projects with bigger museums and international travel, and some really digging in on some projects like the story of Cliff Foss, who designed the Easy Rider bikes and was never acknowledged until the end of Peter Fonda's life that he had made this huge contribution to the film. That story needs developing. He became a friend of mine. I know the story. I broke the story. It deserves a book, and maybe it deserves a film. So that's another project that I really need to dig in on.
Yeah, definitely. You tell so many stories of people. I'm thinking of the woman, I can't remember her name now, Anka
Eve Goldman. Yeah,
yes,
she was the
for
one,
example,
right?
She could also have a book of her own. There's many people you could write a book about that you've written stories about.
Yeah, I actually approached her when I lived in France to write her biography, and she refused. I just went through the same process with John Reed, who was like the Arlen Ness of England. His shop was
Mm.
called Uncle Bunt. And he was the person who really commercially popularized the chopper in England. And he lives here in California. We've been friends for about 8 years. And I was like, John, you're not getting any younger. And I'd like to do a book. And he just said, no, not interested in doing that. So what do you do? It's like, you have a
Yeah,
great
you either
story, man.
pester him or sometimes it
Yeah,
takes pestering if you really want to do it. But I like what you're saying about your going back and asking yourself, like, what's really moving me about this? Because those tend to be the things that become successful. And as you've been talking to, it sounds like there is this kind of grace in your life or like the way that your life decisions have led you. There's things that happened because you were motivated and followed your motivation. So I don't know why I'm saying that, but it just would seem strange to go against it, right? For the market in a way. When there's
yeah,
that kind of, it's that same kind of grace and eros thing. And it reminds me also of riding the bike. There's a different state of being that in that space.
for sure, for sure. But sometimes, I mean, I've made okay money in the last 10, 12 years when I've really completely shifted over. I gave up my contracting. But the reason I moved to Paris was really because I couldn't do my other job, right?
Mm.
I had no connections there. So I had to switch fully to writing as an income. And it was also great for me because I didn't have a lot of friends there and things. I really focused on writing. And it was great for me to develop my skills. And I've been able to make a living since then. But I've always had people who have wanted to help kind of develop this concept and people that I do work with. I mean, I have a team and they're
Hmm.
basically volunteers and we've tried to develop, let's say, the electric revolution idea. And that's the reason why I've kind of dug in. But I think you're right. I mean, that's kind of the conclusion that I've come to is I just have to like dig in on the things that I find moving because ultimately those are probably the things that other people are going to find moving too. And they're really stories that nobody else is telling. Maybe nobody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also your other interests, fashion and things like this. I mean, this is a place where there's a lot of money. And from the style side, I mean, that's also an interesting element.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many ways these days to do things, but you'd be amazed at how, I mean, people bend over backwards and they cater what their content is to the
Yeah,
algorithm.
that's the
That's,
fine line.
yeah, it's to me, that's death. But for some people, that's a career. And, there are people
Yeah,
who make a lot of money doing that. And to me, money is not a motivating factor. It's like, I don't do things for money. I do it because they're interesting to me. So
yeah, and it's
manage
the best way to
those things.
live
Yeah, exactly.
because
So
over a
man,
certain threshold, money is important. We all have to make it, and it's a good thing. It's fine, but over a certain point, if you're not if you're not working from the place that moves you, then it stops mattering and starts even being a burden, I guess. I mean, if you'd created
yeah,
this
exactly.
whole
Exactly.
enterprise on something you hate and then you have to take care of it. Oh,
Exactly. Yeah. So I
mhm.
know I briefly engaged a social media company that, promised to take me to 1 million followers. But what that required ultimately in terms of like content and the production and everything was so noxious to me. I was like, no, I can't do this. This is not
Mhm.
me. It's like I may
No.
fit the suit, but I ain't gonna wear the suit.
Yeah,
Suit may
no.
fit, may not want to wear it.
No, yeah, it's better to stick with what moves you and trust the grace because all these things, they come. It's not like you're not doing hard work and you're giving a lot. That's really the point. It's that you're actually giving a lot with these
Well,
stories and things,
I
opening
think
up paths and
I think it's really important to provide something, to the world. It's like giving something to the world. It's like shining a light on things that I find interesting and moving and like worth exploring and discussing. And I think really how I think you commented earlier about that the way I've discussed these subjects is different. And it's true. I think differently about motorcycling and motorcycle history than most other people. If you look at the bookshelves, I've got thousands of motorcycle books, and they tend to be very, I don't know if I should use the word capitalist but at least industrial oriented. Like they are histories from the factory point of view. And
mhm.
I'm interested in the opposite. I'm interested in the people, the point of view of the people who use, modify, and provide feedback to the manufacturers. It's like the culture of it is way more interesting to me than the factory. And yes, there's cultures within factories and designers, and those are great stories too. But industrial production per se is of very limited interest. What's really interesting is talking about like, well, what's the global impact and what's the relationship between people and these products, and how did they express their love for this thing called motorcycling through dress and lifestyle and film and fashion, so many different ways. It's been really, really fun and fascinating, especially being able to incorporate film into this whole discussion and having a weekly film series on the Vintigent and having done a film festival, motorcycle film festival in New York. It's amazing how often we find a film from the teens or the 20s that's pretty motorcycle centric. That's really cool, or the 30s or the 50s or whatever. It's amazing how much stuff comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's less common because we've really dug in the last 7 years. Having a film every week, that's a lot of films to feature and no duplication. That's 350 movies.
Mm-hmm.
There's yet more. People are still making them and they're amazing.
That's actually an important archive to have, just for historical purposes. And actually, I was trying to get at that too. The way your approach opens up these paths that are already there, but it's like showing the connections between. I mean, that's basically like a snapshot of a historical moment. The style, the values, also this way that the motorcyclist is seen, the rebel or whatever, and what that tension is. All these things in the movies that you've made or that you've curated, it's actually historically very meaningful on many different levels. So it seems like that's kind of the responsibility, to find some way to preserve that and make sure that stays around.
For sure. Yeah, that's been a wonderful experience and exploration. Now, you find these same kind of historical resonances in film. About 4 or 5 years ago, someone said, "Have you seen this film from the 1920s?" And I'm like, "No, I have not seen that film from the 1920s." And it's a short, silent film, and I'm totally spacing on the name right now, done by a surrealist director, and it's black and white. And it's like the model for Girl on a Motorcycle. The film with Marianne Faithfull, that was based on Anke Eve Goldman, because she was friends.
The black
one piece riding suit. But in the 20s, there was this film, and it's literally, that's all it is. It's a woman on a motorcycle, mostly shot from below. So you're looking up at her, and it's this weird landscape, her, and then these weird abstract shapes. It's a very art film, but it's like ultimately like she's having an orgasm on this motorcycle.
Wow.
1920. It's slow, but it's super kind of arty, but it's like, whoa, kind of mind blowing. It's like, wait a minute, somebody is totally clocked. The whole thing, the whole gestalt.
Yeah.
The erotism, the art, the grace, the fashion. She's wearing like a leather helmet and goggles, and this kind of implicit or explicit sexuality of like more for women than for men. I actually wrote the first ever article about, that women have orgasms riding motorcycles, the vibration.
And bicycles and definitely motorcycles. Yeah.
Bicycles too, but motorcycles vibrate more.
Yeah, it's easier.
And can't believe no one had ever written about this. And I pitched it as an article to Psycho World, and they didn't want to touch it. And okay, I'm writing it. And the article's called The Sex Machine. And I involved my film editor, Karina Manflo. I said, I think maybe you should send out the questionnaire to a bunch of women, because if I do it, it could be seen as a little creepy. So out a questionnaire that we dreamed up, and we got great responses. And look it up. It's pretty funny, and has great photographs by this woman, Rita Minisi. She's a New York photographer, and they're amazing. I guess they're self-portraits. She's wearing like this one-piece leather like cat suit, and she's using one of the revival cycles in Texas, a custom Ducati, and she's using curved mylar to distort these images, and they're amazing. The photographs are amazing. So yeah, definitely check out The Sex Machine. It's
that will
the bit at The Sex Machine. Otherwise, God knows what you'll find.
But I love that too, because it also speaks to this pushing the boundaries, but also just observing what they are and maybe questioning them a little, in terms of all the themes that you just raised around sexuality and this female male, and I think it can go in both ways too, right? Because there's something, I think, maybe you can say if you agree or disagree, but in all these movies and in this history from the Cafe Racer on, there's definitely something about men expressing their love of style in a way that's okay, like you can do it
Right.
there because there's always style, and also their love of each other and their need for community, even though it's such
Right.
a solitary thing. And
Right.
those things also don't get talked about in the same way as the orgasms or women being
Right.
used, liking to ride motorcycles and liking the power of it, not just being a sex symbol. So it's interesting to open up all those things. And you do that a lot with your work, don't you?
Yeah, for sure. I'm fascinated with all that. Yeah. And, there's still more room to discuss, like how women feel about motorcycles beyond that one aspect, orgasm. It's like, well, what about feeling empowered? I have written a lot about the dark rider syndrome as it was developed, first clocked by Jean Cocteau in Orpheus, the film Orpheus, which was made in whatever, 1947 or maybe a little later, where Death's henchmen are two riders on motorcycles. And it was the first instance where a motorcycle is associated with death. It was like explicitly a potent subconscious use of a symbol, right?
Mm,
And 2 years later came the Wild One film.
mm,
And I've written about how this kind of notion of what I call the dark rider, like this potency of the motorcycle. It's like the impression that you make. You don't get it on a scooter, you don't get it on a moped, you get it on a motorcycle of menace and power, and how there's a whole branch of motorcycling that's like very much associated with that. Its ultimate expression is, of course, a one percenter clubs. But even Harley Davidson, like in the 80s when Willie G started finally, taking over the company, their advertising in the 60s and early 70s was almost like Honda, like kind of nicest people. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, you got like guys in black leather and going through the city streets at night. It's like,
mm,
tough guy, the dark rider,
hmm.
trope. And I think Harley Davidson suffers from having embraced that.
Maybe
Now it's like it's hard to move a new
anything.
generation, when that's what you're so strongly associated with. They're a victim of their own branding in a way, because maybe not so much in Europe, but in the United States, you tell someone you ride a motorcycle, they say, "Oh, you got a Harley, or you got a club, or you like,
Hmm. Hmm.
are you Hell's Angel?"
Yeah, that's kind of the narrative that most Americans associate with bikes. I think that actually it speaks to something I was trying to get at too, is that you aren't that narrative. You can be that narrative, but what you're doing with your work and the way you even do the books, Current and The Ride especially, these are beautiful
Yeah,
artistic objects. There's something you're opening up, right? So
yeah,
it's almost like people would say, oh, if they ride motorcycles, they don't care about art and fashion. But it's
right,
never been true, as you point out. And there's always
yeah,
been this connection. There's a kind of style. People think very deeply. I mean, you're risking your life. It's not frivolous, and it's not always about being macho. That's just one aspect of it. So you open that up too, even with the books you do and stuff. Is that a conscious thing that you try to do, or is that just coming out of your personality?
definitely. I mean, the books that you mentioned were published by Gestalten, and they have a really strong aesthetic, so they're very open to that. I think my other books, which were published by Motor Books, are a little bit different because it's an American company and they have a different bent that's a lot less about style, except motorcycle style. So that's an European versus American publishing. These are pretty big cultural differences. I just collaborated and am in this new Taschen 2-volume set called Ultimate Collector Motorcycles. And it is the most lavish book about motorcycles ever published. It's 2
Mhm.
volumes. It's slip cased. It weighs like 25 pounds. It's like 10
Mhm. Wow.
kilos.
Yeah, I heard about that one.
Oh, it's just incredible. And it's
Mhm.
like 50 euros. Or for the Lux edition, which is even larger and heavier and more lavish, it's like 850 euros.
Oh.
And, but, we set up a little stand at the Quail Motorcycle Gathering
Mhm.
for the Vintage and the Motorcycle Arts Foundation. And I gave one table to Taschen because the book has just come out and
Mhm.
they had their reps there and they sold 4 of those $850 editions and 11 of the other ones.
Oh,
So
that's good.
people are as you say, with the ride, it's like, it's not an inexpensive book. It was, I think it was probably $50 or $60. And, this
It's
is
like a
really
coffee
upping the
table book,
stakes.
kind of.
Yeah, exactly. This is like really upping the stakes. Like, whoa.
Yeah, it's an art. It's art within itself, and it opens you up to thinking of motorcycles as art.
Yeah,
Even
sure.
even thinking of art as maybe an experience,
Right. Yeah.
not only the object, which I think you also talk about and bring out in your articles and work, that it's not like, even though you create these things in museums, part of that curation is suggesting this dynamism and this, what you were trying to say earlier, you can't actually explain what it's like to be on the motorcycle, but when you bring in the context and the history and the stories, it starts
Yeah.
to become alive.
Yeah, for sure. And also that it's a rich subject that deserves study. I mean, really, I have to thank my buddy Alton Guilfoyle and Charlie Falco for doing the Art of the Motorcycle exhibit at the Guggenheim. I mean,
Yeah.
they were
When was that? 90s, 98, right?
98, yeah.
Yeah. Is that the
They were
first ever
it was the first, yeah,
of
major museum
motorcycles as
exhibit of
art?
motorcycles. And, they really opened the conversation about that this is a subject worth exploring and really changed the global conversation around motorcycling. And I talked with Alton about it. And he's like, nobody even remembers that exhibit. And I'm like, no, that exhibit changed it.
No. Yeah, and I think it's still changing things. You're part of that history that's still evolving. As someone who also doesn't fit in any kind of box, but I also have my motorcycle license. I love motorcycles, and not really the way of riding them, but just as there's so much more there. The art of the motorcycle, but also all the exhibits you have done. I think it's just the beginning of starting to understand this almost as like a cultural theory
Yeah.
or something. It's individual, but it's also community, and it transcends, it's international. So
And it's global.
there's a social component, of course,
Yeah.
also to these exhibits. So I just wonder how you see this relationship between the solitary thing of riding the bike and the community aspect, and how important that is. Or
Well, I mean, everything is solitary, right? I mean,
is it?
fashion is solitary. It's like you're dressing yourself and so yes, the experience is very personal. Although it's less like individual, if let's say you're riding with a passenger, it's a little more, it can be shared. But yeah, I just think it's a normal human thing to whatever you're passionate about, whether it's a symphony or it's art or bicycling or motorcycling or whatever, gardening. Uh, People coalesce around it. They find like-minded people. Communities of interest, I believe, is the term. So supporting the community in a positive way of like-minded souls is like super important. And I really encourage people to attend shows and pay for the ticket and go to events. It's how you keep a community and its events vital. It's like participation. And that's why I have always supported events. I get a lot of invitations and I don't say yes to very many of them. But when I do, it's because I really want to support something. And it's not that I don't want to support other events. It's usually like, I can't travel that much. I get like, oh, will you help us start a concourse in Munich or in San Marino? Like, no, I just don't have the time for that. I'll show up if my schedule permits, but I don't have time for that. So I have to be pretty selective.
Yeah, I bet you do. Do you still find a sense of community in it, though, or do you feel more like you're now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I've so many people who, dear friends and amazing, talented, for me, like one of the major benefits, like I was never interested in custom motorcycles and doubly never interested in choppers until I realized with custom motorcycles is like that I was riding custom motorcycles. Like a cafe racer is a custom motorcycle. I altered that motorcycle to suit my tastes. Like, oh gosh, I guess I've been mucking around with custom bikes since the 80s. So when Cycle World asked me to start writing about custom bikes, it really changed my head. And then I started meeting these incredibly talented individuals who are artists working in the medium of motorcycles. And that has fascinated me. It's been a whole other connection between aesthetics and motorcycling and all the tensions within both the genre in terms of like functionality versus non-functionality and aesthetic trends and copycatism, the people who are really doing innovation, and some people who are, it doesn't really matter. It's like if people are interested in aesthetics, they're going to do their thing. But it's been amazing meeting a few people who are really, truly gifted, and it's been exciting. And a lot of them have become friends. And that's been a rich reward for me personally, like meeting incredible people who are also certain collectors and certain other writers, so that's like on the personal level, my community. It's like finding my peers, and then in the more broad sense, like finding it really important to support the community as a whole, because it's changing a lot, especially publishing, starting in about 2010, Bike Eve and Pipebird and all these other blogs about customization have really introduced a whole new audience. But now those folks are 10 years older. They're 30s and 40s now. And,
Yeah.
How do you get the teenagers?
I guess there's patterns, and some of it goes back to that. What is this rebellious or edge work today that we do associate with this kind of cafe racer or the James Dean, or I don't know, is that still able to connect in a world where we have to rethink what motoring even means?
Yeah. Well, I've done a lot of stuff around electric vehicles, the first book about electric motorcycles, and done a lot of articles. And yeah, that can exist in the electric scene too.
That's what I really wanted to talk to you about. That the electric revolution was the exhibit you did at Peterson.
Yeah. Yeah. And
that was after the current?
It was after the current. Yeah. Okay. I started the current as a web vertical on our website, just doing stories about the electric industry. And we had already done Custom Revolution. That was my first exhibit at the Peterson. And when I was approached by the Peterson to curate an exhibit about Southern California custom motorcycles. I said, well, how about if we do something that's more like the global? There's never been an exhibit of the global custom scene. So they supported me in spending a lot of money shipping bikes from all over the world that were like apex examples of custom motorcycles from Japan and Germany and England and the United States. For our next exhibit, I thought, well, maybe we should do something about the electric industry, because I had just done the current with
the book, or there's a book, a beautiful book with the little cake,
with a cake on the cover.
It's such a beautiful book. Oh, another one, another beautiful bike, but perfect choice of the cover.
Really beautiful. So yeah, we decided the next exhibit would just be Electric Revolution after Custom Revolution. So it seemed perfectly natural. But we had started the current thread years before, and I've been writing about electric bikes since 2009. But anyway, Electric Revolution proved to be like hugely popular. Like we got something like 1 billion media impressions on that exhibit. And it was an important exhibit for me too, just kind of as an expression of a culture around a new medium. That's like motorcycles. Yes, they've been around forever, but electric motorcycles have not, and electric cars have not. And the concept around Electric Revolution as an event, we were developing this kind of festival, was to help create a culture around electric vehicles like we've had a culture around gas vehicles for 130 years. So drag racing and drifting and rallying and, races around the center of a small town, like stand-up scooters or electric bicycles. And there is a culture developing around electric vehicles. So kind of highlight that culture as a way of supporting the industry. And I've come to the conclusion now that the industry doesn't need my support anymore. It's not that I'm not interested, of course, but I feel like the industry is standing on its own legs now. Like when I first started riding in 2009, the industry was not standing on its own legs.
I was about to say, you sort of helped create that as a pioneer with this exhibit and this book. Those are
right. Yeah.
Those are markers for sure.
Yeah.
It shows that it's worth people's time and energy in a way. And it showed that so many people are interested in it.
Yeah, exactly.
And it documents this historical change. What do you think about this change in motorcycling? Do you think it's either or with ICEs or EVs, or how is it manifest in their own
choice? We may not have a choice, given legislation. I mean, my eyes were really opened about the electric motorcycle scene 2000, 10 years ago. We went to Shanghai. It wasn't that long ago, actually. It was more like 8 years ago. And and internal combustion small vehicles have been banned in the center of Chinese cities for a long time. And so everything there is electric. And it's like, it's quiet and the air is fresh. And it's like, oh my God, this is the best thing in the world. Right. And so it really kind of opened my eyes of like how it could look in an American city or a European city. Having lived in France, it's like in the summertime when you've got 80 mopeds, hopped up mopeds, like gunning their exhaust at a green light, and the air is suddenly filled with two-stroke smoke, which has a ton of unburned alcohol fuel. It's like your eyes are stinging and it's miserable. And you can do the same thing without creating any fumes. We can have the same level of fun without the obnoxious element. So I'll always love my internal combustion motorcycles, but let's be realistic. The future is here. Norway is already 40% EV, and it ain't going to be too much longer before the rest of the world is. Tesla's already the number one selling car in California. It's the future. And I've got some heat because of the environmental impact of, let's say, lithium mining and rare earth mineral mining, which is serious, but I'm sorry, the petroleum industry has led to like how many wars? The petroleum industry has greatly impacted geopolitics. Huge. It made the Middle East one of the most important places in the world. So there are huge issues to overcome with a new technology. It's like, how is the power generated and how is it stored? What kind of impact are we going to have creating this? They can barely even recycle these batteries. It's like absurd. And these are the things that have to be focused on. We need better batteries. We need to recycle all these materials. And if it's truly going to be green, we got to have our power production that's green. A lot of opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. And maybe rethinking a lot of the transportation networks that have been built up by this traditional form of motoring, the roads, the way the cities are created. There's a lot of things that sort of have to be rethought. We have to do some kind of mentality shift about basically we have to change now, and we have to find a new way.
Yeah, for sure. And it's going to impact everything in the same way that gasoline powered vehicles changed everything. They changed how we structured our roads, our cities, everything. There was actually just last week, there was a fascinating story on NPR about parking and how parking regulations in American cities from the 1960s made it impossible to create cities as we have known them, and basically created the kind of this weird suburbanization of any new developments where you get like giant big box stores squatting in a sea of parking, and they're like, you look at the appealing center of every old major city in the world, you can't build like that anymore unless there's a giant 4 stories of underground parking beneath it. So a pedestrian oriented city is no longer possible with the current regulations. So maybe changes in how we view transport and things like that will revive the design of cities to make them much more kind of human centric and a lot less transport centric as they have become since the 50s, really.
Oh, yeah. And that just reminds me of these trucks and that whole infrastructure of the way we ship our goods and stuff. I just had to drive back to Amsterdam from an event I had in Berlin, and it's just one whole lane. It's just truck after truck after truck. And you just think about it like, what is this? What are we doing? We're like moving things from one place to another in this really awful way. And it's not good for the drivers either.
No.
Something has to really change in that way.
Yeah, for sure. Our investment in rail, especially in the United States, oh my God, it's been horrific. We haven't had like a new design of train in 70 years. It's horrific. You see these huge accidents because we put no money into our infrastructure, which has a lot to do with where we spend our money, which is trillions of dollars on wars in foreign countries, instead of developing like every country should be developing a modern infrastructure, high-speed rail, and also, just as you mentioned, commercial rail with sophisticated delivery systems with lots of branches so that there's a rail car coming right into the center of San Francisco that's distributing goods through green methods, short haul delivery instead of freaking trucks. Yeah,
Yeah,
crazy.
exactly. Or finding new ways to have materials, for example, like 3D printing or something, where you have to ship less. It reminds me of other things you were talking about, where it's just a shift of perspective. You kind of had this shift when you went and saw the city in China, but how can everyday people have this? I know you've written about it some, but it's almost like we're just in this inertia, right? We don't realize there's another way we could do it. Is it going to
Yeah.
take an ecological disaster or?
Well,
think that-
unfortunately, that's often the motivating force. I mean, for China, it was just the levels of noxious pollution in the city centers that led them to create this legislation. And they had a ready enterprise that could step in very quickly and fill the gap. But for the last 10 years, I've been asked by small electric motorcycle manufacturers, it's like, what do you think the tipping point is going to be? What's going to be the design that's like the Honda Cub of the electric industry? I said, I don't think it's going to be a design. I think it's going to be legislation, and it's happening. Paris and other cities. Paris has already banned vehicles over 20 years from the city center. And it's not going to be that long before they're going to ban any vehicles that are not electric from the city center. We're close to that. And I have to say that for as much as I love my vintage vehicles, it makes sense. Hello, we have to do things that aren't completely selfish and support, what's necessary for the evolution of our cities and our society. Yeah, we need to rethink how things are going, because 100 years of burning gas is having really a negative impact.
Yeah, it really is. And it definitely feels urgent,
Yeah,
to say the least.
Yeah, as a former environmental studies major, it's like, yes.
Yes, it's definitely urgent.
It was urgent then.
Yeah.
43 years ago, we were talking about this
Wow.
stuff.
Gosh, yeah, you were already
Jimmy
thinking.
Carter put solar panels on the roof for the White House, and Ronald Reagan took them right back off. This had been up for over 40 years, and there's just been a tremendous amount of resistance because of entrenched industries. What's threatening there? It's an existential threat for the oil industry, and they're incredibly rich, and they have a lot of influence. And there's a lot of history and a lot of culture, and those forces have also had their voices heard. There's a lot in the motorcycle world who are like, I don't want anything to do with electric bikes. I like my bike. I want to be able to ride my bike, my internal combustion bike, forever. It's like, well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. And that's just reality. It was never always thus, and no one guaranteed you the right to have X. But, if you would try riding an electric motorcycle, you would probably find that it's a lot more fun than you think. You make the noise, the vibration, the vibe, but, the sensation of motorcycling, the core of it, that kind of miracle of physics that is two wheels, is the same. And it will develop, it will improve, and it will become the norm because it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Unless someone figures a way to develop, to create hydrogen profitably, which hasn't happened. No conspiracy out there about getting rid of hydrogen power. It's like, no, it's just not there
just
yet.
Haven't figured that one out yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to let you go soon, but what's that?
It's been a great conversation.
It has, and I could keep talking to you, but I realize now it's really been a while. You probably need a break. But I do wonder what this idea of forever motoring, electric motors, or whatever kind of motors. I mean, you're a historian of motorcycles, but you're in the motoring world, and you've seen these patterns, and you've seen how important it is to people. Do you think that's going to shift with this electric change, or however we address this urgent problem? Or do you think that's something that we have to find, we'll always have, in a way, this exploration and all these things we've talked about already?
Yeah. We'll always be people, right? There's nothing new under the sun, right? So, okay, maybe it's electric bikes. That means people are going to create subcultures around they happen to be using electric motorcycles. So you'll have the touring subculture, and you'll have the sport riding subculture, and you'll have, young urban freakos who are making 80-mile-an-hour stand-up scooters. That's already happening. It's already happening. So everything old is new again. Everything new came from, we'll find you a historical president. That's my job, from the 20s or the 1860s, that says, yeah, we're just doing the same stuff. We just are wearing different things, and the thing itself looks a little different. But I'm completely confident that there will always be expressions of a love of speed and a love of motorcycling in whatever technology is available. I mean, even look at Star Wars, didn't that land speeder that Luke was speeding around, it looked like fun, right? It's like, oh, motorcycling, or this is hot rodding. Whatever form it takes will be just fine.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful answer. Last thing I'm going to ask you, because I have to, is about Richard Vincent. Did he just pass away recently?
Yeah, he did.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Gosh.
Yeah, well, he was doing what he loved. I didn't
Mhm.
really publicize it. He was on his motorcycle and he was down riding between Santa Barbara and Ventura on Highway 101. And he was riding past his favorite surf break at Rincon, a legendary surf break. And all those photographs and films that he took in the 60s were taken at Rincon.
Oh
Yeah,
gosh, that makes me a little emotional.
I
Wow.
know. It was a great surf break. Surf that day. There was a fantastic wave. And I think he got distracted and he hit the center barrier on the freeway and was killed instantly. And so it's tragic and it's also kind of poetic. It's like that's where he began. That's where his story began and that's where it ended. And, he was doing something he loved. He was clearly connected by something to something he loved, like in the sea. And we all got to go sometime. And Richard definitely could have hung around for another 10 or 15 years and been an example to us all and told a lot of great stories. But there you go. I can think of worse ways of going.
Yeah, I love it that you describe it like that. It somehow I can see that all the elements were there. It's
Yeah.
never a happy moment to think about this. It's painful, but somehow there's something about that.
Yeah, there's a kind of circularity in this whole life story that's kind of beautiful.
Yeah. And like in your video, I think he says something about racing being like waking up in the morning, or riding is like waking up in the morning or something. It's kind of like a new going to sleep, or I don't know.
Yeah, I'm like 2/3 of the way through a feature documentary about Richard.
Film Interrupted, is that still the title? Because now Interrupted has a whole other view.
Exactly. Wow. Probably Interrupted. We have not really settled on it. That was a working title.
Okay.
But we'll see. I think we had gotten all the interviews we needed from Richard. We had decided that previously, but there was still some contextualizing to do on my end and inserting his photography and things into the narrative. It's beautifully shot. Our director, Brent Deal, is an amazing director, and our cinematographer, Leonard Alexander, he's an amazing cinematographer. So the footage we have already is beautiful. That's the property Richard created in Oregon. He bought this completely clear-cut stretch of land on the hills by the Oregon coast, and he bought it for a song in the mid-70s. And over the subsequent 50 years, he made it into a park. I mean, it looks like a state park with gorgeous meadows, and the trees are now 50 years old, and so they're mature, and there's wild elk, and he restored the salmon runs and the trout runs and the creeks.
Such a interesting ecological story too.
It really is.
Ties in all the themes we've been talking about in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does for sure. It's so funny, if you knew Richard, you would never clock him as an environmentalist, but in fact, his life legacy is the restoration of this 2,500 acres of land,
That's so beautiful. I was going to ask you, what do you think his legacy is? Is it really about motorcycling, or is it about this perspective that he gave? Or
I mean, it's kind of both. I didn't realize what he had done. I had visited his house once, but I hadn't really looked at the property. And my parents had a house in Sea Ranch, which is similar. It's like a house in the hills above the water. So I was used to this kind of environment and thought it was beautiful, but didn't really know the history and what Richard had done. So I was purely attracted to his photography and films from the era, from the early 60s, and his story of being drafted to Vietnam and then becoming a hermit after he was injured and then reemerging 45 years later. But as we were filming and kind of were getting footage of this property, we realized, oh my God, there's a different story here, that's not motorcycling. That's like, how does a person heal from trauma? And what if that healing healed a whole landscape? That's an amazing story. So
that is very beautiful. It reminds me of something else you wrote about the healing effect of moving through landscape. I think it's also in the writer intro.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
for sure.
think of it in that way of moving through a landscape on the bike, but also moving through the landscape in terms of what he did, with your life and changing it, becoming part of it, healing as healing yourself. And I think that also speaks to what we were trying to talk about with having to change our patterns in motoring. There's some bigger story in his story, isn't there? Almost like
Absolutely.
even with his death now, there's some big lesson there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so funny that he would be very reluctant to term his life story that way. That's not how he thought about his life but from the outside, and even his own family, it's obvious. He wasn't that guy, if you know what I mean. That's not how he talked about himself in his life. But everyone else, it was abundantly clear that this was the arc of his life. And it's sad to say, but it's also true that sometimes, people have to get out of the way of telling their own story or having their story told.
It's hard for us to see our own lives as
as I was saying with Anki Eve Goldman and John Reed, people like not wanting their story told. You get what you get. You tell the story you can. So hopefully we have enough of Richard's story on film that we are able to finish this whole project the next year, I hope. I mean, it's just happened, so we're still grappling with, okay, what does this mean? And we're in no hurry.
It sounds like there's an important lesson there. And I guess it's hard for all of us to be vulnerable. I mean, another quote of yours that I'm remembering now, where you say something about it's hard to talk about why being on a bike moves you because you feel vulnerable. And I think it's also hard to talk about your life, as these people in that way too, because you have to open up to your vulnerabilities. So maybe that's part of why people say no. They don't want to have to really be seen.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a lesson for all of us. It's like the corollary to that. I mean, so there's the one aspect of, being shy to tell your own story or feeling like you don't really want that kind of focus put on you. But on the other hand, what we often fail to see, and even what I often fail to see, because I feel doing the work that I do is very isolated, like it takes people sending me a note once in a while to realize, oh, somebody's reading this, and hadn't. But
whereas everyone assumes that everyone's reading it, so it's even weirder. A little bit like fame, where
I guess so.
Kind of in a bubble.
Yeah, it's like it's impossible to have that kind of exterior perspective unless you get that kind of feedback. But I think it might be important, let's say in the case of John Reed, it's like to understand how much their story can mean to other people. It's like, this is important. You had a unique life story and it was very interesting and you did your thing and you were successful and you had an impact and people want to read about that because it's important.
It's so important. It's the most important thing we can give. It goes back to this exploration idea we talked about with the Overland exhibit, opening up new paths for people. That's why it's important that these people let their stories be told while they're alive or why they should be told after they've passed away, because otherwise those paths close, everything grows up around them again and someone else will have to forge through. So these stories are so important, just in terms of trajectory. You can think of it like a landscape, to go back to that again. And they've found ways, and those other people need that. It's a bigger picture. I think you can tell that with Vincent's story too, and it shows people that they can care about what they really care about, and they can heal, and it can also be healing in a wider way.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great, it's like becomes part of your purpose in life. It's like sharing your story. It's like, it's actually not an act of ego. It's actually a service.
It really is. If you're living in that vulnerable place and you're really trying to tell the story, which is not easy, but I think it's what we all try to get to, or we try to do for each other. If we can't do it while we're alive, then other people help do it later. But is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure you say, or anything you want me to put in the notes?
Yeah, I mean, there's the stuff that we're doing that I haven't even mentioned. We just did this whole educational offshoot that a couple of folks in my team have been really interested in, where we discovered this young man in Ghana, a teenager, Samuel Aboyag. Maybe you could just share the story, but
wasn't he in Electric Revolution too?
He was Revolutionaries, yeah.
Revolutionaries, yeah.
And Yeah, we recently hooked him up with Art Center College in Pasadena and got him a year scholarship and a computer and mentorship. And now we sent him to a design conference in Marrakech. So
Mhm.
it's a component from the Motorcycle Arts Foundation that my team is especially interested in. It's super fulfilling sending Samuel to Marrakech and seeing him like thrive in a completely new. And the guy had never left his hometown, and first time in a foreign country, first time doing a Zoom meeting, first time
Oh, wow.
XYZ, and just
Life
him
changing.
embracing it. And we're now like grappling with, okay, how do we raise funds to do more like this?
Towards a good reason, a good purpose.
Yeah, totally.
And it sounds like you have good people around you. I mean, you just kind of know everyone and have gracefully kind of flowed through all these different worlds. Must feel a little surreal at times.
Let's say 45 years of meditation have definitely made me very present minded. So
Mhm.
here I am, there I am. Drives my wife crazy at times. You're so focused on whatever you're doing. It's like, well, that's what I do.
Oh, yeah, but that's a great skill. Well, I hope you both have a beautiful day there and the sun comes out for you.
Well, it's lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you, Paul.